Hello team, and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. This is a Ukraine War Update Extra video, giving you extra tidbits and nuggets to get your teeth into to give you a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. I'm a little bit late today. I've just been round the neighbours for a kind of coronation celebration thing, a bit of a neighbourhood get together. It was supposed to be outdoors, but it's been raining, so it's indoors. I'm ambivalent about the monarchy, but it's nice to get together and kind of I guess celebrate these new hat ceremonies. This is about as monarchistic and nationalistic as my attire goes. I've got my keep calm by focusing on philosophy. Yeah, that's how cool I am. I am that cool. Anyway, enough of that nonsense. Let's get on to talking Ukraine and not the philosophy of inheritance. Okie dokie. We'll start with retired Lieutenant General, I think that stands for, Ben Hodges, a very eloquent and really incisive analyst on the war in Ukraine. He details here how making Crimea untenable for Russian forces and liberating it is the key for Ukraine's future security and rebuilding its economy. Nothing I disagree with there. I don't disagree with most things about taking Crimea, other than maybe the order in which it's done. I don't think there's any point in rushing down, getting all the momentum, getting to the borders of Crimea, if you like, and then storming it by ground or indeed by amphibious crossings of the Sivash or whatever. I think you need to stop at the northern crossing points and hit it with long range artillery and ordnance in order to make it untenable for the Russians to stay there. Hit the Kerch Bridge as well, and then the Russians skedaddle because they're just getting hammered by drones, by missiles, by HIMARS, etc., etc. That's how I would do that. I think is absolutely vital. I think the whole war is about Crimea, and if Ukraine want to get Russia to the negotiating table, they can't do that, I don't think, without Crimea being in their hands. I think that is absolutely vital. If they go to the negotiating table and the Russians are still in Crimea, it means that Russia will negotiate about Crimea and for Crimea, and that's the absolutely what they want. That's the whole game, is Crimea, I think, for the Russians, at least as it stands. If you think of all the land that they have now, the Donbass, or most of the Donbass, and Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and a bit of Kherson Oblast, a bit of Zaporizhia Oblast, realistically, I think they would give that all up to remain in control of Crimea. It has a connection to the Russian mainland through the Kerch Bridge, and if they have that control, they get that warm water, deep sea port that gives them naval access to the Mediterranean and control of the Black Sea. That is their game. Ukraine, that should be their game, and I think that obviously they're going to recognise this. They know this. But I don't think it's going to be an easy nut to crack in terms of a ground attack without doing some serious softening and shaping of the battlefield first. Anyway, let's see what he says in interview here.
Here I'll ask perhaps the most important question to you, someone who's definitely well-versed in the art of war. If you were asked for advice, Mr. Hodges, what would you say to Ukraine? What should they do? What strategy should they follow? Where should they start, and what direction should they advance in?
I believe that Crimea is the decisive terrain. When Ukraine has captured and liberated Crimea, that changes everything. The whole wars will have changed. And I think the General Staff knows that as long as Russia occupies Crimea, that Ukraine will never be safe or secure. That Crimea is like a dagger that's pointed into the belly of Ukraine. So there's no
100% agreement
way that Ukraine can settle for an outcome where Russia controls Crimea. And then
are you saying that Ukraine would start, that the Ukrainian armed forces would start with Crimea?
No, I'm coming to that. I'm trying to explain why it's decisive. Okay. And of course, Ukraine will never be able to rebuild its economy as long as Russia occupies Crimea, because it blocks access of Azov Sea. They could dominate the Black Sea coast. So this would make it impossible for Ukraine, I think, to really rebuild its economy as long as Russia occupies Crimea. So that's why the General Staff, I'm sure, has recommended that the liberation of Crimea has to be the priority, not the liberation of Donbass. Once
100% agreement so far.
So if I were advising, and of course they don't ask me, nor should they ask me, but if I were advising, I would say, this counteroffensive should aim to isolate Crimea, to break the so-called land bridge that runs from Rostov through Mariupol, Melitopol into the peninsula, break that, and then bring up more and more long-range precision weapons, HIMARS and others, that can then hit Crimea. So the point is to make Crimea untenable for Russian forces.
Here I'll
So I hadn't listened to that, but I'm glad that's exactly what I think as well. Sometimes I do wonder whether I know what the hell I'm talking about, but actually Hodges and myself are aligned there. I definitely think that Crimea is the number one goal. It is the most important goal. In fact, I don't think they can have any other big goal. If they don't have Crimea, it's kind of game over for negotiations. They have to have Crimea. It's that important. But the only way you get Crimea is by making it untenable in the way he suggests. Total agreement there. Right. Eagle Gherkin, who has been, this was actually from yesterday, been a little bit pessimistic today, says Vladimir Tretiak. He says it is time to start thinking about preventing Russia from falling apart because military defeat is near. Wow. Okay. So let's see what he says in this translation. Igor Gherkin, Igor Strelkov, remember, is the former military leader of the militias, the DNR, LNR militias from 2014 onwards for a little while, and eventually came back to now being a military blogger, a mil blogger, an ultra-nationalist one. So he is fully in favor of this war, but he's hypercritical of how it's being executed. And he is an interesting one to listen to because he is often quite correct in his criticisms of Putin, and those are growing and very risky, and his criticisms of the Russian MOD. Regular readers, he says, and listeners should remember the assessment of the situation that I laid out and expressed last winter. One of these was, if the necessary national measures for the successful conduct of the war are not taken before May, we will not be able to win this war. I state, no measures have been taken, and he writes that in capitals. No measures have been taken. In other words, this is me speaking. In other words, we ain't going to win this war. Those measures had to be taken by May. They haven't been taken. Okay, to continue. Neither organizational nor personnel. The goals of the war have not been determined, and the inhabitants of the planet of the pink ponies, PRP, have not understood that, quote, this war will be fought until one side is victorious. Accordingly, since there is no goal, there is no strategy. No strategy, no conscious work on its implementation. But the enemy has a strategy from the beginning and is being implemented with all its might. More and more successfully since the Kremlin is playing giveaway with an inexplicable enthusiasm and childlike confidence in the ultimate contract that is comfortable for the elderly ponies, elephants, and unicorns. Now we have to think about how to preserve the state, the country, and the people in a situation of impending military defeat. I think he's nailed it here, because I have been saying myself, I've been saying this since last April when I wrote an article on it. In fact, let me find that article. I do keep referencing it. So here's the article on Only Sky. Where to now, Putin? Because there's no way you can win. April the 4th, 2022. Not long after the beginning of the outbreak, I realized and wrote about the fact that he was stuck in Ukraine with no way of winning, accidentally in a war, because he thought it would be a special military operation, that he would take the whole of Ukraine by deposing the government in a lightning strike and then having the Rosgvardia and other kind of non-proper army personnel to clear up afterwards in a kind of 2-week. It was a 2 to 3 day operation that would take 2 weeks to properly clear up and sort out. By which stage Zelensky would have been assassinated or would have run away, and they would have deposed the government and replaced it with a puppet government. That was the intention, but that didn't happen because the Ukrainians fought them every inch of their invasion, and they were left inside a country ill prepared for an actual war. Instead of having people working them with open arms and bunches of flowers, they had people working them with javelins and NLAWs. And they, as I say, they weren't prepared for that. So they were stuck there and ill prepared for a war without the right number of troops, the right type of equipment, etc., etc., etc. No strategy and no goal, no aim, because their aim had been blown out the water. So they then had to make up new objectives. And the problem is, and I talk about this here, I'm pretty sure in this one, I list the situation. Yeah, I talk about plan A was the key of overthrow. It went to plan B, and this is the time of April last year. Plan B went badly, so they went on to plan C, and then sort of plan D, and then without plan D, it was like, okay, where are you now? And it's still the same. We're 1+ years on from there. We're in May now, 2023, and the situation is identical. So please go and read this article, see if it stands up. I asked you to do that some months ago, and a few of you read it and said, yep, still stands up then. It's the same case now. They are stuck in Ukraine with no conceivable way of extricating themselves from this quagmire. And exactly as Gherkin says here, if you don't have a goal, you have no strategy to implement that goal, and if you have no strategy, you have nothing to you have no direction. You don't know what you're doing. No one knows what they're doing because there is no justifiable, conceivable goal. What can they achieve? They don't have the forces anymore in terms of personnel. They would need to do mass mobilization to achieve anything beyond what they've got now. And they don't have the equipment. They're not going to get the equipment unless China suddenly do a volte-face and say, we're going to provide you with loads of equipment and start World War III, which they ain't going to do. Russia are not going to be able to replace their losses with anything significant. They can get out a bunch of old T-55s that have been mothballed, and that's about it. They can make a couple of tanks per month because of sanctions, and it's just it's not going to happen. So what is the off ramp for him? I don't know how he can win, and therefore the question is, what does he do? How does he get out of this with his head held high? I think it's impossible. So what are the only other options? Nuclear, but then China's not going to be a fan of that either. So I don't understand how this finishes. The only way I can see this finishing is a complete military loss to Ukraine, and then some kind of coup in Russia, or some kind of political upheaval, or some kind of assassination attempt, or ill health gets the better of him, or something. There's no other way I can see where Russia extricate themselves from this problem, and Putin gets to say to his public that, hey, yeah, we succeeded here, job well done. I don't think there's any way that can physically happen. So all the the pro-Russian voices in these threads going, back with the victory, and isn't it, yay, Russia, Slava Russia, and all this nonsense. It's like, I know you're paid to say this by Bot Central, but like, what are you actually expecting? Like, where's this army coming from? Where's this well-trained, well-equipped army that's going to take on the Ukrainians who are fighting for their homeland, fighting for their family, fighting for their friends, and being bankrolled by the rest of the world to some degree, and being militarily supported by NATO and their allies? Against what Russia has, which is a failed army using obsolete equipment with no conceivable way of replacing that lost, destroyed, captured equipment. Anyway, I'm starting to rant, so I will go back to our good friend Igor Evil Gherkin. Okay, so to repeat, now we have to think about how to preserve the state, the country, and the people in a situation of impending military defeat. And yes, even for a worthy, non-fatal defeat, in which our enemies will be forced to abandon their plans for the complete fragmentation of Russia and the elimination of its sovereignty, we will have to, Do you think really that Ukraine are bothered about the complete fragmentation of Russia and its elimination of its sovereignty? No, they're not. That's nonsense. We will diverge here, Mr. Gherkin, because that's not what I mean. He says our enemies. What does he mean? The US, NATO, so on and so forth. Do you know what? I'm pretty sure everyone would be happy with Russia getting out of Ukraine, 1991, borders being maintained, and that's that. Because do you know what, Russia, you're pretty screwed anyway. You can go and lick your wounds and deal with the fallout of that failure. Because some of those things might happen, like the fragmentation and whatnot, might happen if you retreat, having not achieved any of your goals. But that's another story. That's not the intention. The intention here for everyone is that Ukraine maintains their sovereign territories and a sovereign right to democratically define their future in all of their territory. So we'll have to fight long and hard, he says, harder and longer than it would have been if we had fought to win decisively from the outset. And the longer the occupants of the PRP will linger in the sweet languor of confidence in their peaceful and happy old age, which has long come for most of the VIPs, the less chance that in the end the Russian ship will manage to get out of the military storm and systemic crisis without sinking after long and bloody troubles into history. Ooh, he is being sharp here and highly critical, but also, deeply realistic in what the state of affairs is and what Russia is facing here. And this isn't me being like overly optimistic and pro-Ukrainian. This might be a really long, heavy slog. It might be years in the making. Ukraine might fail in many of their intentions in the coming counteroffensive. I don't know either way, right? But still, Russia can't win. Still, they're buggered. And no amount of false bravado from Russian propagandists will change that. I'm confident of that. Right, okay. To move on, let's go to another Chris Owicki thread. He's an independent, his military history author and researcher. Rampant corruption is reported to have rendered Russia's ballistic missile early warning system virtually useless. Scams by contractors have said to have led to unsuitable foreign-made components being used on a wide scale. The VCHK OGPU Telegram channel, this is one that he uses quite a lot to get a handle on what sort of pro-Russians are saying when they are being critical of their own situation and their own leadership and military hierarchy. That channel reports that a scandal is about to break over a component substitution scam that it says has crippled Russia's early warning radars. Such scams have been widespread in Russian military procurement, often with the collusion of corrupt officials. According to the channel, quote, for several years, Putin has received numerous memos about the deplorable situation with the Russian early warning system. All assurances about the reliability of a continuous radar field and the high tactical and technical performance of the early warning detectors of the Voronezh radar system turned out to be groundless. The average price of each radar before the crisis amounted to more than 20 billion rubles, $257 million, and the production of highly prefabricated stations was carried out by RTI-JSC, a subsidiary of AFK Sistema. The Soviet-era developments of the Scientific Research Institute of Long-Range Radar, NIDAR, and the Radio Engineering Institute of the USSR Academy of Sciences were used as the basis of the work. Most of the components, as usual, were purchased abroad, and under the guise of procuring expensive transistors protected from interference and radiation, the brains of the radar were supplied with cheap parts that were unusable for military purposes. This made it possible to have a huge profit margin. 1,000 different kinds of radio components were purchased for cents and invoiced for hundreds of dollars each. According to a source, the result now is that Russia has unstable radars which provide a window of opportunity to hit Russian territory without retaliation. While building expensive stations along the entire perimeter of the borders of Russia, the system for informing the country's top leadership about a missile attack has itself never been seriously modernized. It's like putting new digital fire sensors on an analog alarm. In Soviet times, Vimpel was the leading enterprise in the field of development of the early warning system. It was connected with institutes and plants which, in close cooperation, solved the problem of development and operation of the system. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Vimpel lost its leading role, and since the times of the Soviet Union, its algorithms have not been seriously updated. In recent decades, the world has been actively developing near-Earth space, and there are already hundreds of commercial and military satellites in Earth orbits, which often interfere with domestic early warning systems because all the mathematics for it was laid down in a different near-Earth environment when there were very few satellites in orbit. Very interesting. And actually, when I did my whole piece the other day on satellites, someone in the chat said, I can't go into details here, but back in 2014, we put a satellite up in the air, up into space in Europe. And they said, and he was saying it was miles ahead of what the Russians were doing. Like the gap between the Russian capabilities, and this is going back to the satellite situation, but obviously very similar to radar here, in terms of that kind of technology of sensing, of acquiring targets, of mapping out locations and locational data, just miles ahead. The NATO and the West miles ahead of what the Russians can do, and that translates into very different capabilities on the battlefield. Anyway, I thought that was quite an enlightening thread from Chris Owicki. Right, I'm going to do a bit of, I guess, self-awareness in some sense here. Somebody has put a well thought out criticism of me and what I do here, but in a good way. I like this. And I like the way he's done this, rather than shouting at me and saying, I'm unsubscribing. Actually, couching it quite nicely and saying, right, here are the issues I have with you. So let's see if I agree with them and whether I can improve. Jonathan, I just subscribed to your channel because I wanted to leave this comment. I love your channel and have watched every video you put out over the last 6 months, 6 or more months. Wow, thank you so much. You do a fabulous job. Really appreciate that. I'm from the USA, a conservative Christian. Okay, can you see where this is going? Because I'm the antithesis of that, but hopefully we can meet somewhere in the middle. A lifelong Republican who did not vote for Trump either time. So I find that very interesting. Especially there's a really strong correlation between conservative Christianity and voting for Trump, which is very interesting given the loads of moral dynamics going on there. And I've written on that in the past, but that's a whole different rabbit hole I shouldn't go down now. But he says very pro-Ukrainian, and I love these very interesting people who don't fit all the kind of preconceived ideas of what I might have or we might have or other people might have, and believe the USA should provide F-16s and anything else to ensure Ukraine wins. So a really interesting bunch of stuff. So when I say stuff that's going to agree with part of what he says, like the pro-Ukrainian F-16s, ensure Ukraine wins, give him everything, he's going to say, yep, I love what you're saying. But when I insult conservative American politics, he's going to obviously take issue with that. So let's see where this goes. Is what I would imagine. Having said all this, I believe your liberal views taint your reporting. And I would agree with him. They absolutely do. It's really difficult to distance our own personal morality and our own politics from giving analysis on anything, because at the end of the day, I'm giving political analysis. I'm giving geopolitical analysis. And that's really difficult to do absent of any kind of preconceived political ideals. What you end up doing, and I know people like to slag off in Britain, people on the right slag off the BBC for being too left wing, and people on the left actually slag off for being too right wing. If you look at all the political commentators and people in like Today Programme Radio 4, our political editors on the BBC, they've all been from conservative parties. Really interesting. So the left slag off it for being too right slag off for being too left. And what ends up, the BBC ends up being in the middle. And when it does political analysis on its news programs and other type programs, it steers a really careful line and actually ends up being quite politically vacuous because it can't commit to either side. It ends up trying to do analysis, which is kind of more factual analysis, but without an overlay of what they believe, which is very different to the US, where you have MSNBC slagging off the right and you've got Fox News slagging off the left openly as news sources, attacking the politics and attacking the politicians. The BBC, as part of its charter, can't do that. But what that means is yes, it's accurate, and yes, it's actually quite neutral and objective, although neither side likes to admit that and they like to slag it off. But I think that makes it lacking then in like juicy meat to get your teeth into. Anyway, that's my opinion. You keep going on how it is not really costing the USA as much as the headlines would lead you to believe. This is true. However, you make it sound like USA is profiting and making huge sums off the war. I'm sorry if I've said that. It's not quite what I believe. It's not like, let's go into this because it's going to make us a bunch of money and we're going to make billions. But I was trying to say that there will be entities that are making money because that's what happens in war. As a great Ocean Colour Scene song, profit and peace. There's no profit and peace, so we've got to make some war. That the song lyrics of that are just absolutely on point. And so the military industrial complex will be making money off this. Of course they will, but it's not to say that the US as a whole is making gazillions of dollars off the back of a war. And if that's come across, I'm sorry for being not clear on that, but I do get your point. This turns a lot of people off in the USA, including myself. This war, which I support, is not making the USA richer. The stock market is down, and one of the reasons it is down has been the Ukraine war. My retirement account has gone down significantly, and a portion of that is due to the war. Really, really pertinent point, and well brought up there, that actually this is costing people in other ways, and that itself may take. I mean, this guy is obviously David Hess here, and I really appreciate this comment, is saying, look, I'm really pro-Ukraine. I think we should give them everything, even though it is negatively affecting my own financial future. I think, and that's really great, because I often think about politics in terms of voting. So many people vote, most people I think vote for parties. Not necessarily, there might be a left-right divide here, and correct me if I'm wrong, and whether you think I'm being too liberal here. But actually this flows into individualism versus collectivism. So I think people that vote on the right, and that's often classed as individualism. They don't want collectivism and socialism, right? So therefore the right looks about libertarianism and individualism. But in that way, when they vote for political parties, arguably they vote for parties that profit themselves more, that they gain out of it. Whereas someone who votes more towards a collectivist ideal is voting for a collective, a sense of an ideal for more than them. So it is sometimes voting. So I've voted for parties before that I know the policies will financially negatively affect me, but I like to think I'm voting for the moral good of the country, because it's not just voting about things that make my life better, but things about making our lives better. So there's a really interesting dynamic there. And yet here's this guy who's going against that from my preconceived ideals here, by saying, yeah, I'm on the right, I'm a conservative Christian. And you might, I don't know whether that he's individualistic or as in, in that kind of that spectrum, and whether he's saying, and despite that, I still want these policies to be enacted. So yeah. 2, you seem to be okay with Rheinmetall making big profits, but not okay with oil companies profiting. It's not quite true, actually. So I've talked about Rheinmetall making lots of money and helping out, but at the same time helping out Ukraine here, and in fact profiting on that, but that inspiring them or motivating them to do the right thing. But I'm not saying them, and I've actually talked about my cognitive dissonance about the military industrial complex making money off this war. I have a problem with that, but I understand that that's in the realms of capitalism, that's kind of almost necessary. But it's when it gets to absolutely ridiculous levels in the way that oil companies have got to. So we're talking record profits for oil companies that have never been seen before. And the key here, where I've been slagging off the oil companies more than the military companies, is that particularly in Britain, we have had people struggling with the cost of living that can't afford their energy, right? So both the energy production and the energy distribution companies are making record-breaking profits. Meanwhile, people are not being able to afford to heat their homes, and the government having to set up a charity based on the Ofgem, which is the energy regulator in the UK, setting up a charity to give money to these people so that they can afford to live. And at the same time, the companies that are having record-breaking profits, because the price of this stuff has gone up, instead of cutting their profits and allowing these people to afford their heat, their energy, are saying, no, we're not going to do that. We're just going to make even greater profits. That is a dynamic that I find horrendous and really problematic. So in other years, I would be slagging off in the industrial military complex making profit out of war. because I find that problematic. But actually, I understand it. But I think those two things are quite different. So I would like to just differentiate those things and say that they are two different areas. He says I am okay with both making big profits. Yeah, there's a difference between big profits and obscene profits that are unjustifiable. And when you have the BP treasurer saying, literally said, the quote is, "We have more money than we know what to do with." When you have an institute, when you have an organization saying we've got more money than we know what to do with, and the people who are buying that stuff saying we can't afford to heat our homes, I know what he can do with that money. So I think I'm okay with making profits. Like if you're going to have capitalism at all, it's the least worst kind of for economic like mechanism, I guess. But if you're going to have that, you're going to have profit motivation. But I know it's arbitrary, but at some point it gets too much and unacceptable. Billionaires, in my opinion, are unacceptable. I wrote a piece on this. In fact, I'm going to find that now again. So the piece was called "On Defending Billionaires." I wrote this back in 2020, right? And the piece looked at this. It looked at quite a few bits and pieces, but there was a quote that I think is worth looking into, or meme that's worth looking into and understanding. And I think it and it's verified. These figures are verified. It adds up, right? So it's not just lying here. This is the maths works. If you worked every single day, making $5,000 every day, $5,000. Imagine having $5,000 every day. That's more money, I'm sure, than you really need, right? But $5,000 every day. From the time Christopher Columbus sailed to America to the time you're reading this tweet, you would still not be a billionaire. And you would still have less money than Jeff Bezos makes in a week. Now, okay, you can talk about the money Jeff Bezos has. Is it liquid money, or is it like the value of the company and all that kind of stuff? That aside, when you talk about billionaires having money and you're defending them saying, "Oh, we shouldn't windfall tax them, we shouldn't do this," and you're like, yeah, but at the same time, there's huge amounts of poverty and people in this country are really struggling, blah, blah, blah. And it's worth knowing how much a billion really actually is. And it's more money than you probably think it is. And it's more money than you think it is by a massive margin, right? There's also some data, there's also some analysis to suggest that if you took all the billions of dollars off every billionaire in the world, but left them still with $1 billion, well, they've still got $1 billion, you would be able to say you would be able to solve world hunger for 282 years. But we don't do that, and they accumulate and get more and more and more, and it's vastly more than they need, and it gets to this obscene level. So should we be defending obscene amounts of money, I guess is the question. Sorry, I am going off on one, but I hope this is of some interest to you. I'm okay with both making big profits. Rheinmetall is making weapons to help Ukraine, and oil companies are replacing Russian oil, which helps Ukraine. Yes, but they don't need to make that much. There's got to be. At what point do you say that? Because this looks like they've made record-breaking profits. So is that still okay? What if they tripled that? Is that still okay? What if they quadrupled that? What if they're making all that money and everyone else in the world can't afford to eat? Like, is that still okay? So what I'm trying to say is, at what point do you say, okay, enough's enough? Can that just go on forever? Or is there a point where we say, do you know what? The inequality here is so vast. The chasm between the rich and the poor is so vast here that it is morally abhorrent. That there is something morally, like if I was sitting there making all that money myself, it was Bill Gates, who was the richest man in the world, said fairly recently. I've got it in that article actually. He talks about how he's not worth that much. As in, the value of the stuff he's done isn't worth the amount of money he's got. He finds that a bit of a problem. He can't. He's trying his best to try and spend that money, but and do it and spend it in nice ways. But he's even struggling to do that. It's just like there's that much money, ridiculous amounts. Anyway, sorry, I'm going off on one. You are very critical of capitalism. Yes and no. It's a bit nuanced. I agree that there is no such thing as pure capitalism, agreed, and that it would be bad, agreed. I believe that one of the main reasons the USA is so wealthy is that we tend more towards pure capitalism than other capitalistic countries. Okay, I would have a criticism here. So, and this depends on how you do things like averages. So if you look at the average income, or no, GDP, right? And you look at the GDP of the US and say it's phenomenally high. It's much higher than many other countries. And you look at wealth statistics, and you say, okay, look at the average wealth of everyone in America, and by taking all the wealth and dividing it by the amount of people in America, so take your mean average, then it looks really high, and you go away thinking, God, the average person in America is really rich. But what that hides is that the super rich have so much money that it shifts the average up. But that so much money is distilled in the top like 2%, right? And that actually, when you start coming down here, what looks like the average in the middle, these guys are actually really quite poor. So there's a massive cavern. The wealth inequality in the US is absolutely behemoth. Is one of the worst in the world, particularly in your more developed nations. And so it is one thing to say that the USA is so wealthy by looking at the average, but it's another thing to go around the USA and go to some of these poor neighborhoods and say, okay, what does wealthy look like across the whole of society? How many people are living in this in poverty compared to where the wealth inequality is far less? In the Nordic countries, have one of the world's best sort of wealth distributions, and they have regulation in place to stop company executives making vastly more than those at the bottom of the rung in any organization. And they also have the highest well-being quotients, and so on and so forth. So yeah, it's a lot more nuanced than that. Okay, so European capitalism tends to have more socialistic characteristics, yes. And then when you translate that across into well-being, I would say then that is preferable. So yes, it will have more socialist characteristics, and that's a good thing, but not pure socialism and not pure capitalism. I'm an advocate of a mixed economy with a quite high tax threshold if you're sorting out a decent welfare system that translates into better quality of life, better standard of life, etc., etc. Go and look at World Happiness Index, the World Happiness reports that comes out every year. Okay, 4. You have a piece on how the USA is viewed globally. Every time there is some issue in the world, the USA is asked to get involved. This could have a criticism here. It's not necessarily asked to get involved, but it gets itself involved. Like, it's not necessarily that people had to write a letter to the US and go, oh, please, can you come and get involved here? The US would be thinking, okay, Russia are playing a geopolitical game here, and we need to get involved to stop them doing this. So I think that's a slight misunderstanding of the situation. This causes one side to be happy and one side to be mad with the USA. This is the burden that comes with being the most powerful country in the world. I'd agree with that. There is a good portion of the USA, not me, that are tired of being the world's policeman and want to be more isolationist. Again, it's not like the USA is going like, oh God, here we have to go again. God, I'm so tired of being the policeman. It's like that's what they're choosing to do, because actually that when you are the most powerful nation in the world and you want the world to operate in the way that you want it to operate, then you need to get involved to maintain that hegemony that you have, that supreme power that you have. You need to be putting things in place to keep that going, so that actually supports your own economic well-being as well. There's so much to talk about in this comment that I think isn't quite understanding why the US will get itself involved. It's not so much that people are asking. It's not that they're going to go, okay, we're coming to help you out for just because it's a nice moral thing to do. It's like why didn't the US? I always say this about Britain. Why didn't Britain go into Zimbabwe when Robert Mugabe was? Well, it's because they didn't have any oil fields. Why did we go into Kuwait? Because they did have oil fields. Okay. So things like that. It's like, why do we get involved in certain places around the world? We get involved if we think it's, yes, there's a moral component, and sometimes morality is super important and plays a larger role. But quite often it's about looking after your own national interests, where national interests are economics. So it's worth also adding that economics being the main component of national interests that the armed forces are fighting for, does also have a moral dimension, right? The famous mantra, "It's the economy, stupid," is super important, because if you don't get the economy, you tell me one country in the world that has really good human rights, that has an absolutely terrible, absolutely dire economic situation. You will find that if you don't have sorted economics, and you don't have tax income to pay for a decent welfare system, decent education, X, Y, and Z, to then get you to the point where you're in a good position to have human rights. Sadly enough, in war-torn countries, or I don't want to be a bit circular, it's sadly enough in countries where you've got like abject poverty, you're going to have people scrabbling to get money. You're going to have corruption, you're going to have X, Y, and Z, and human rights take a real back seat. It's a bit like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. As soon as you sort these lower rungs of the ladder out, or the pyramid out, it's not a pyramid, it's a triangle, and actually he didn't see it like that anyway, but nonetheless, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is sort out your physiological needs, you go up and up and up, and then once you get up here, once you've got all these things sorted out, then you can think about self-actualization, etc., etc. Well, let's translate that across into politics, which is you sort all of these things out, and you get your country to a point where, yeah, is everyone healthy and safe and got a roof over their head and warm? Okay, we've got all those basic things. We've got the tax to sort out those things. We've got a welfare state. We've got functioning economy. Okay, because we've got a functioning economy, etc., etc., etc. We get to this point, right? And this will help us be able to institute human rights across the board and give you all we can concentrate on all these things at the top of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So in other words, morality is in some sense supervenes on. That's a philosophical word to say. It depends on. You're not going to get all this kind of moral activity unless you've got a sound foundation of kind of well-being, which is itself built on, and morality is kind of well-being to some degree, but which is built on sound economics. And you might look at some lovely moral like villages here and there that in tribal villages or something somewhere else that doesn't have all this like big tax and economic situation, but actually they will have those hierarchy of needs sort of sorted out, and then they can get to a point where they're talking about, hey, you can't do that in our village, and living nicely and having human rights. I don't know, I'm going off on one note, I have to think about that, but you get the point where it's the economy stupid. So by governments concentrating their armed forces on defending like the moneyed interests of the country, that then allows the country to take on a better kind of moral stance and human rights and all these other things. So the morality is arguably wrapped up in looking after their national interests, economically speaking. But there's so much to think about there, and so much discussion to be had about some of these ideas, and I could be completely wrong. And do challenge me. This is just a stream of consciousness at the end of the day, just stuff splurging out of my brain. The USA was blessed with great geography, an ocean on the east and west, a great Canadian ally in the north, and great Mexican ally on the south. We are food and energy independent. Yep, you have all of these things going for you. USA arguably has fewer security threats than any country in the world. Your reasoning for supporting Ukraine should be more based on morals and less on how USA benefits so much. Yeah, it'd be nice if the world operated like that, but it just simply doesn't. Like I've told you, I mean, there are many times the UK could have got involved in conflicts around the world, but didn't, because it wasn't cost effective to do so. Morality, otherwise you would go around in every single conflict. If it was only on morality, we'd just be getting involved all over the shop. You have to pick and choose why you get involved and where you get involved, and it can bet your bottom dollar it's about economics. I wrote another article on this after speaking to someone in the Navy whose job was doing the logistics for these kind of conflicts and where we're going to spend money and help out and so on and so forth. So let me find that article. So the piece is called "The Armed Forces and Their Remit, Corporations and Morality." And the idea that we think our armed forces go around the world acting morally, but actually they go around the world to conflicts that are in the national interests of the nation that they represent. And those national interests are often economic, as I've mentioned already. Now, one of the easiest ways to understand this is to think about pirates in the 16th, 17th, 18th century. Right, you had gold going across the Atlantic. Our armed forces got involved to stop the pirates. It wasn't for moral reasons. They weren't fighting off pirates because that's a right thing to do. They're protecting the national interests of their country, which is, you know, exploiting other nations, taking their gold and shipping it back to the homeland. You know, money going backwards and forwards. That's a kind of way to understand it. So when we have our navy out in the Red Sea and near the Suez Canal and all down there off the coast of Africa near Somalia, we are protecting what we're protecting. We're protecting oil trade. We're protecting cargo. We're protecting. This is about economics. Our armed forces are effectively protecting our economics, which is our national interest, and it's quite important to understand that. And my article was looking at that entirely. Feel free to have a look at that and whether I succeed in getting that point across. Obviously, there's an awful lot more to think about in that area than I'm explaining here. I guess this is a quote that I used at the end of the article. I spent 33 years and 4 months in active military service, and during that period, I spent most of my time as a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism. I helped make Mexico and especially Tampico safe for American oil interests in 1914. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National City Bank's boys to collect revenues in. I helped in the raping of half a dozen Central American republics for the benefit of Wall Street. I helped purify Nicaragua for the International Banking House of Brown Brothers in 1902 to 1912. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for the American sugar interests in 1916. I helped make Honduras right for the American fruit companies in 1903. In China in 1927, I helped see to it that Standard Oil went on its way unmolested. Looking back on it, I might even have given Al Capone a few hints. The best he could do was to operate his racket in 3 districts. I operated on 3 continents. So that's Smedley D. Butler from War is a Racket, the anti-war classic by America's most decorated soldier. That is a fascinating insight to what I'm trying to say here, which is that sadly, war is often either directly about money or it is a massive component of it, and our national interests are often economic interests. But again, that might be controversial for a lot of you. Let me know what you think. I probably don't have time to go into the 5th point, but I love this. There's so much rich conversation stimulus in this. So David Hess, before I'll do your 5th point later. He said, I try to be respectful with my comments. I love your channel and look forward to watching it every day. This is someone that's like, yeah, it's not about I'm gonna be nice to you, and then it's not like a shit sandwich. Like I'm gonna be nice, and then I'll be nice to you at the end. I mean, that's no. This is like I'm gonna disagree with you, but I'm gonna do it with respect, and I like that. And then we can have a conversation, and it gives me an opportunity to express my thoughts in more detail to try and justify my positions where you think I've gone wrong, or maybe you've not quite understood the nuance here. Anyway, let me know what you think. Has this made you think a little bit differently about anything, or do you just think I'm completely wrong, or do you agree? Let me know. I'd be fascinated in your opinions. Anyway, I'll leave it there. I've banged on too much. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon. Please like, subscribe, share, blah blah blah, all the usuals. And I'll speak to you tomorrow.